When my son, a military cybersecurity expert, changed our Wi-Fi password, things quickly spiraled out of control. A woman, a total HOA. Karen completely lost it. Sounds harmless, right? Well, it's not. She had no idea we were tracking her every move, every device. And when she realized, let's just say she wasn't ready for what happened next. What went down? You'll have to stick around to find out. Comment below if you've ever had a Karen like this in your neighborhood. For more crazy stories like this, check out QA Stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. I used to love the quiet suburban life. After a decade in the corporate world, it was all I could ask for. But that peace was shattered the day Janet moved in. The house next door, once the perfect picture of tranquility, became the stage for a nightmare I didn't see coming. My son Chris, a military cybersecurity expert, thought it was nothing at first, but I knew something was off. I'm Mark. I'm 42 years old, and what happened next changed everything. I thought I knew about neighbors. Chris is the quiet type, always immersed in his gadgets. Growing up, he had a knack for making things work. Computer systems, anything. He worked with the military on cybersecurity, and when he started spotting strange things around the neighborhood, I knew he was the only one who could make sense of it. The kid can make computers do things that honestly look like magic to me. He's got these government clearance credentials that I don't even pretend to understand, but I know he's dealt with some serious cyber threats in his work. Before Janet showed up, we had this perfect little setup. Quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, everyone minded their own business. It was exactly the kind of place where you could actually relax after work without worrying about some drama brewing next door. Chris would come home from his military base, we'd grill burgers on weekends, watch football, and just enjoy that peaceful suburban life that honestly felt too good to be true. The neighborhood had this rhythm, this comfortable predictability that made every day feel safe and normal. Janet made an entrance like no other. From day one, she was a force in the HOA. She didn't just fit in, she took over. Her first week in the neighborhood, she was already scribbling down violations, measuring lawns, and inspecting mailboxes. One afternoon, she cornered me in my driveway and warned me that my lawn ornaments were too close to the curb. This woman is 55 years old, has this perfectly styled blonde hair that probably costs more than my monthly grocery budget, and walks around like she owns the entire neighborhood. She walks around with this permanently disappointed expression, like the whole world has personally offended her just by existing. She drives this pristine white SUV that she parks at exactly the same angle every single day, and I swear she measures the distance from the curb with a ruler. Janet became an aggressive HOA member literally the day after she moved in. I'm not even exaggerating here. She showed up to the very first meeting with a clipboard and a list of violations she'd already spotted around the neighborhood. Within her first week, she was patrolling the streets with that clipboard, writing up everything she could find. Trash cans left out too long, mailbox colors that were apparently 2 shades off the approved palette, kids playing too loudly in their own front yards. She complained about everything and everyone. The woman actually carries a measuring tape in her purse to check if people's lawn decorations violate the 3-foot setback rule. I watched her from my window one morning, literally measuring the distance between my neighbor's garden gnome and the sidewalk. At first, I tried to be polite, just wave and nod when I saw her. But when she started mentioning personal details about Chris and me, I began wondering how much she was really watching. She'd say things like, "I noticed your son stays up pretty late playing those computer games," or, "You watch a lot of streaming shows, don't you?" At first I thought maybe she could hear our TV through the walls, but our houses aren't that close together, and we're not exactly loud people. Chris wears headphones when he's gaming, and I keep the volume down when I'm watching Netflix. I started wondering if maybe she had some kind of superhuman hearing, or if she was just making lucky guesses. But the comments kept getting more specific and more frequent. She'd mention what time we went to bed, what shows we were binge watching, even what takeout we'd ordered the night before. The thing that really started bothering me was when Janet began complaining about internet bandwidth hogging in the neighborhood at HOA meetings. She'd bring it up constantly, saying someone was using too much internet and slowing down everyone else's connection. But here's what didn't make sense about that. We don't have shared networks in our neighborhood. Everyone has their own individual internet service. So how would anyone's usage affect anyone else? I mean, I'm no tech expert, but even I know that's not how internet service works. When I mentioned this to Chris, he gave me this look. You know the look I'm talking about. that quiet, calculating expression that meant his brain was already 3 steps ahead of whatever I was thinking. He said, "Dad, that doesn't make technical sense. Unless someone's accessing networks, they shouldn't be accessing." The way he said it made me realize that maybe my paranoid feelings weren't so paranoid after all. Maybe Janet really was doing something she shouldn't be doing. Over the next few months, I started developing this really uncomfortable feeling that we were being watched. Janet seemed to know things about our routine that she shouldn't have been able to know. She knew when Chris stayed up late gaming, when I watched movies, what time we went to bed. She knew even what apps we were using on our phones. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I was just imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It got to the point where I'd close our curtains during the day and check over my shoulder when I was bringing in the mail. One evening, after Janet made another weirdly specific comment about our family's habits, I finally brought it up to Chris. I said, "Son, I think Janet knows way too much about what goes on in our house." Chris looked up from his laptop, and for the first time in months, he actually seemed concerned. He said, "Dad, that's not normal neighbor behavior. That's surveillance behavior." The way he said it, all calm and matter of fact, made my blood run cold. I realized that my son, who deals with cyber threats for a living, was taking this seriously. That meant I should be taking it seriously too. The implications of what he was suggesting started sinking in, and I felt this cold dread washing over me. That was when it hit me, she knew too much. She mentioned something about Chris's late-night gaming sessions. How did she know? And that was just the beginning. Chris started noticing something odd with the internet connection. We had intermittent slowdowns, but it wasn't until Chris mentioned it casually that I realized something was off. "It's not just the bandwidth," he said, looking up from his laptop. "There's a pattern here, and it's not us." And after that conversation with Chris, I started paying closer attention to Janet's comments, and honestly, they were getting more specific and creepy by the day. The woman seemed to have an impossible amount of detail about our daily lives. She'd make these casual remarks that seemed innocent on the surface, but when you really thought about them, they were impossible for her to know. Like when she said, "Your son was up pretty late last night playing those computer games. I hope he's getting enough sleep for work." Now our houses are at least 50 feet apart, and Chris games with headphones on in his room, which faces the back of our house, not toward Janet's place. There's no way she could hear anything, and there's definitely no way she could see his computer screen from her house. I started feeling paranoid more than just a little. The curtains were pulled tighter, I checked the locks twice. But when Janet casually asked, "Do you guys order Chinese food every Thursday?" I froze. She couldn't know that, could she? She also knew specific details about what streaming services we used, what shows we were watching, even what time we typically ordered dinner. I started keeping a mental list of these comments, and it was getting longer every week. The precision of her knowledge was starting to terrify me. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. I mean, how could she possibly know when Chris was gaming? It's not like he's making noise or causing any kind of disturbance. The kid is practically silent when he plays. So, how was Janet getting this information? I started losing sleep over it, wondering if we had some kind of stalker situation on our hands. But Chris, being the methodical person he is, approached it from a completely different angle. His military training was kicking in, and I could see the wheels turning. A few days after our conversation, he came to me with this serious expression and said, "Dad, we need to talk. There's something wrong with our internet security." I could tell from his tone that this wasn't just a casual tech support conversation. This was his professional voice, the one he probably uses when briefing his commanding officers about security threats. I honestly didn't want to hear what he was about to tell me, but I knew I needed to know. The gravity in his voice made my stomach drop. Now, when a military cybersecurity expert tells you there's something wrong with your internet security, you pay attention. Chris explained it to me in terms I could actually understand. He said every device that connects to the internet has a unique identifier, kind of like a fingerprint. And he'd been monitoring our home network as part of his regular security routine when he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. There was an unknown device that had been regularly accessing our home Wi-Fi for months. The way he explained it made me realize that someone had been essentially living in our digital space. Chris dug through the router logs, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. "This isn't just someone using the internet," he muttered. "We've got an intruder." His voice was calm, but the words hit me like a punch. Someone had been in our house watching us. Chris showed me logs on his computer screen, and even though I couldn't understand all the technical details, I could see timestamps showing this unauthorized access happening almost daily. It was like looking at evidence of a crime that had been going on right under our noses. But that wasn't even the worst part. Chris dug deeper into our devices and found spy software on my old tablet. I had no idea what spy software even was, but Chris explained that it's basically like having someone looking over your shoulder every time you use your device. This software could track what apps I was using, what websites I visited, even where my tablet was located in the house. The really scary part: this type of software requires physical access to install. Someone had to actually touch my tablet and deliberately put this spy program on it. Chris showed me the installation date on the software, and it matched up perfectly with a very specific memory I had. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I actually had to sit down when I put the pieces together. This wasn't some random hacker on the internet. This was someone who had been inside our house, someone I had trusted enough to let in voluntarily. The violation felt personal in a way I can't even describe. That's when the memory hit me like a brick wall. About 4 months ago, Janet had knocked on our door, asking if she could check something with her sprinkler system. She said water was pooling weird in her yard, and she wanted to see if it was coming from our side of the property line. Being a decent neighbor, I let her walk around our backyard and even invited her inside to wash her hands when she was done. She seemed so grateful and normal that day. I actually thought maybe I'd been too harsh in my judgment of her. She used our bathroom, washed her hands at the kitchen sink, and I even offered her a glass of water. She was in our house for maybe 15 minutes total. I remember thinking at the time that maybe Janet wasn't so bad after all, that maybe she just came across as aggressive because she was new to the neighborhood. I even felt a little guilty for judging her so harshly. What an idiot I was. While I was trying to be the good neighbor, offering hospitality and giving her the benefit of the doubt, she was planning to violate our privacy in the worst possible way. I felt sick realizing that Janet had used my attempt at neighborly kindness to plant spyware on my tablet and gain access to our Wi-Fi network. The violation felt personal in a way I can't even describe. This woman had been in my home, accepted my hospitality, and the entire time she was planning to spy on my family. I mean, who does that? What kind of person looks at someone offering them a glass of water and thinks, perfect opportunity to install surveillance software? I was disgusted, angry, and honestly a little scared about what else she might have done while she was in our house. I started second-guessing every interaction we'd had, wondering if she'd been planning this from the very beginning. Had she been watching our house timing when we left, figuring out the best way to get inside? The thought made my skin crawl. Chris immediately shifted into what I can only describe as professional mode. His whole demeanor changed, and suddenly I wasn't talking to my son anymore. I was talking to a military cybersecurity specialist who'd just identified a threat. He said, "Here's what we're going to do. We're changing the Wi-Fi password tonight to cut off her access, and then we're going to monitor what happens next." He predicted that Janet wouldn't react well to suddenly losing her access to our network. As Chris set up a new security protocol, I realized something worse than I had imagined was unfolding. Janet wasn't just some nosy neighbor, she was tracking us. And now she was about to realize that we knew. Chris changed our Wi-Fi password that night, using some kind of military-grade security protocol that I didn't even pretend to understand. He explained that this wasn't just changing a simple password. He was implementing what he called penetration-resistant encryption that would make it nearly impossible for Janet to regain access. I went to bed that night with this weird mixture of anticipation and dread washing over me. The question wasn't if Janet would notice her access had been cut off. The question was how long it would take and exactly how explosive her reaction would be. I didn't have to wait long to get my answer. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., our doorbell started ringing like there was some kind of emergency. Not the polite single ring of a normal neighbor visit, but this aggressive repeated pressing that made it clear whoever was outside was not in a patient mood. I looked through the peephole, and there was Janet standing on my porch, literally trembling with what I could only describe as pure rage. Her face was flushed red, and her perfectly styled hair looked disheveled for the first time since she'd moved in. The doorbell rang sharply. I opened it to find Janet standing on my doorstep, her hands trembling slightly. She was furious. "What did you do to my connection?" Her voice wavered with barely contained rage. I hadn't seen her like this before. I opened the door, and before I could even say good morning, Janet immediately launched into her attack. "What did you do to the internet?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. I played innocent, asking her what she meant, and suggesting that maybe she should call her internet service provider if she was having connection problems. But Janet wasn't buying my act for even a second, and that's when things got really interesting. Janet escalated quickly, making it clear she wasn't talking about her own internet service. "Not my internet," she snapped. "The connection I've been using to monitor neighborhood security activities." I actually had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at that moment. Did she really just admit to using someone else's internet connection? Was she seriously standing on my porch confessing to unauthorized network access? Her desperation was making her careless with her words, revealing exactly what we'd suspected all along. Her face turned bright red, and she stepped closer to me, almost nose to nose. "You think you can just cut me off like that?" she shouted. "I've been monitoring the neighborhood for everyone's safety. You're the ones who are ruining it." Her words didn't match her eyes. There was fear behind them, fear of exposure. That's when Janet's mask came completely off. She started screaming about how she had a right to monitor the neighborhood for security purposes, how she'd been keeping track of suspicious activities. The woman was completely unhinged, waving her arms around and backing me toward my own front door. The woman was so angry she was practically spitting as she talked. She threatened to document everything and involved the HOA in what she called my deliberate sabotage of neighborhood security protocols. Then she stormed off my porch, muttering threats about consequences and documentation. I watched her march back to her house, and I honestly couldn't believe what had just happened. This woman had basically confessed to spying on the neighborhood while standing on my front porch. She had admitted to unauthorized network access and called it monitoring. Her reaction was so extreme it confirmed everything we'd suspected about her illegal surveillance operation. I wasn't sure whether to be amazed at her boldness or concerned about her complete lack of awareness about what she'd just revealed. Either way, I knew this wasn't over. True to her word, Janet delivered on her threat faster than I expected. That same afternoon, I found an official HOA violation notice in my mailbox. The letter was typed on official letterhead and signed by Janet in her capacity as Neighborhood Security Coordinator, which was apparently a title she'd given herself. The accusations were so ridiculous, I had to read them twice. She was actually doubling down on her confession with written documentation. According to Janet's formal complaint, I was being cited for disrupting shared neighborhood network resources and interfering with community security monitoring activities. The fine was $200, and the letter demanded that I restore network access immediately to prevent further security compromises. I was literally being fined for changing my own Wi-Fi password. The audacity was breathtaking, but more importantly, Janet had just provided written evidence of her illegal activities. She'd put her confession in writing and signed it. The woman had essentially handed us a smoking gun wrapped in official HOA letterhead. When Chris got home and read the letter, he actually started laughing. He pointed out that Janet had basically written a confession and submitted it as official HOA documentation. There are no shared networks in our neighborhood, so her reference to shared neighborhood network resources was an admission that she'd been illegally accessing someone else's network. Her demand to restore network access was essentially a written request for me to allow unauthorized access to my private internet connection. The woman had documented her own crimes. Chris said he'd never seen a criminal case where the perpetrator provided this much self-incriminating evidence voluntarily. Chris explained that Janet's phrase community security monitoring was particularly damning because it showed intent and ongoing surveillance activities. This wasn't a one-time mistake or an accidental connection. This was an admission of systematic spying that she was trying to legitimize by calling it security work. The letter was basically a roadmap of federal crimes written and signed by the perpetrator herself. I couldn't believe someone could be this careless with evidence. It was like she wanted to get caught. Her desperation had made her reckless, and now we had everything we needed to destroy her completely at the HOA meeting. Chris was focused, his hands moving over the files. "This isn't just a neighborhood dispute," he said. "We've got proof. If this goes to the HOA, it could get ugly. We need to make sure she doesn't turn this against us." I stood there staring at the evidence in front of us, wondering how we got to this point. Tomorrow at the HOA meeting, everything would change. I just didn't know if it would end with us in control or completely destroyed. Chris didn't hesitate. He began typing furiously, configuring our router with military-grade encryption. "We need to make this foolproof," he muttered. I watched a mix of dread and resolve settling over me. Was this really the only way? Or were we just making her angry enough to escalate things even more? His fingers moved across the keyboard, with practiced precision, implementing security protocols that would make our network impenetrable. Every click felt like we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross, preparing for a war neither of us truly wanted to fight. The sound of his typing echoed through the house, like gunshots, each keystroke sealing Janet's fate and ours. A few days before the scheduled HOA meeting, Chris called me into his room with an expression I'd never seen before. His laptop screen was covered with what looked like a digital crime scene, complete with charts, graphs, and technical data that made my head spin. "Dad," he said, "I've mapped out exactly what Janet's been doing, and it's worse than we thought." He'd used advanced tracking techniques to trace every unauthorized access attempt, and the results were honestly terrifying. The systematic nature of her surveillance operation was becoming clear, and the evidence was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Multiple monitors displayed various data streams, creating an intimidating command center that looked like something from a spy movie. The doorbell rang frantic and fast. When I opened the door, there was no hiding the fury in Janet's eyes. She was shaking with rage, her breath coming in short bursts. "What did you do to my access? Why would you cut me off like this? This is a violation." Her hands trembled as she spoke, but there was something more, something desperate. Her perfectly styled appearance was cracking, revealing the unhinged person underneath the facade. The mask of the concerned neighbor was slipping away, replaced by someone who looked capable of anything when cornered and exposed. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air, and her usually immaculate makeup was smudged around her eyes. Chris showed me 4 months' worth of documented evidence proving Janet's daily Wi-Fi intrusions into our network. He could pinpoint the exact time she'd accessed our internet, how long she'd stayed connected, and even what activities she'd monitored during each session. The logs showed that Janet wasn't just occasionally checking our network. She was accessing it multiple times per day, sometimes for hours at a time, building detailed profiles of our family's digital activities. The violation of our privacy was systematic, calculated, and far more extensive than either of us had initially realized when we first suspected something was wrong. Each timestamp represented another breach of trust, another invasion of our most private moments. Chris set up the software, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. With every click, I felt the walls closing in. What if Janet had already gone too far? What if she was already watching us as we set this all up? Using network triangulation techniques that I didn't understand but trusted completely, Chris had traced the location of Janet's device during every unauthorized access. The data clearly showed that every single intrusion came from the direction of Janet's house, with connection strength and signal patterns that matched her exact address. There was no room for doubt or alternative explanations about who was responsible. The precision of the data was frightening, like having a digital fingerprint of criminal activity. The spyware analysis revealed the full scope of Janet's surveillance operation. She'd been monitoring our streaming services, tracking what shows we watched, and when we watched them, recording our sleep schedules based on device activity, and even logging what apps we downloaded or deleted. Chris showed me months of data that Janet had collected about our family's most private digital habits. She knew our routines better than we did because she'd been systematically documenting every electronic activity in our house. The invasion of privacy was complete and thorough, extending into every aspect of our digital lives. It was like discovering someone had been living in our walls, watching and recording everything we did in what we thought was the safety of our own home. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. Chris discovered that Janet hadn't limited her surveillance to just our family. The evidence showed that she'd successfully breached at least 3 other Wi-Fi networks in our neighborhood, including the Rodriguez family 2 houses down and the Thompsons across the street. Janet had been running a systematic surveillance operation that affected multiple families, gathering intelligence on nearly a quarter of our entire neighborhood without anyone's knowledge or consent. Her operation was far more extensive and organized than we'd ever imagined possible from one person. The woman was essentially running a private intelligence agency from her suburban home, treating our entire neighborhood like subjects in some twisted social experiment. Chris explained that while Janet was busy spying on everyone else, he'd been unintentionally gathering information about her activities during his investigation. Military cybersecurity training had taught him to monitor threats comprehensively, which meant tracking the source of attacks as thoroughly as defending against them. The irony was perfect. While Janet thought she was the invisible spy watching everyone else, she'd actually been under surveillance herself by someone with far superior technical skills and training. She had no idea that her every move was being documented and analyzed. The hunter had become the hunted, and she was completely oblivious to the fact that she'd been caught in a trap of her own making. Chris finished the setup and turned to me. "We're good for now," he said, but his voice lacked certainty. I didn't feel good about it. The real question was, what would Janet do when she figured out we knew everything? The weight of what we were about to reveal hit me as I tried to process the magnitude of evidence Chris had compiled. We weren't just dealing with a difficult neighbor anymore. We were about to expose someone who had committed multiple federal crimes and violated the privacy of several families. Tomorrow's confrontation would change everything, and there was no going back from what we were about to unleash. The evidence was so damning that it would destroy Janet's life completely, and I wondered if we were ready for the consequences of wielding that kind of power. Janet walked into the HOA meeting like she owned the room. She gave a practiced smile to the group, turning on her charm as she started her presentation. "We've been experiencing major security issues," she began, her voice steady but laced with a hidden threat. "And I've been working hard to fix them for everyone." Chris and I arrived at the community center early to secure front row seating and set up his equipment before other residents arrived for what everyone knew would be the most dramatic HOA meeting in our neighborhood's history. He carried his laptop and projection gear with the same confident bearing I'd seen when he left for work at the military base each morning. Janet made her entrance fashionably late, wearing a Navy power suit that screamed authority and confidence in a way that was clearly calculated to intimidate anyone who might challenge her version of events. She surveyed the room like she owned it, making deliberate eye contact with various neighbors and nodding approvingly at the turnout she'd orchestrated through her campaign of accusations against us. When her gaze landed on Chris and me in the front row, I caught a flash of satisfied smugness cross her face. She clearly thought she was about to watch our public humiliation and destruction while positioning herself as the neighborhood hero. The meeting began with routine HOA business that everyone sat through impatiently, but we all knew why we were really there. Janet had made sure every neighbor knew about her accusations against us, painting herself as the security-conscious resident trying to protect the neighborhood from our alleged network disruption activities. She had positioned this whole thing as good neighbors versus troublemakers, with herself as the obvious hero of the story, and us as the villains threatening community safety. Her performance was calculated and manipulative, designed to turn the entire neighborhood against us before we had a chance to defend ourselves. When the chairman called for Janet's presentation, she stood up with theatrical authority and launched into an elaborate performance about what she called serious security issues affecting our neighborhood's digital infrastructure. She talked about network resource disruption and attacks on neighborhood infrastructure, like she was briefing federal agents about terrorist activities rather than discussing a Wi-Fi password change. The woman actually brought a folder of fake documentation to make her surveillance activities look legitimate and professional. Her act was so convincing that I could see some neighbors nodding along, obviously believing her version of events. Chris stood up with confidence, but his eyes never left Janet. "You've been accessing our Wi-Fi, and it's not just us," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the room. He pulled up the first piece of evidence, a log showing Janet's device connected to our network. The room fell silent. He clicked to the next slide. More logs, more connections. "Here's the full list. You've been spying on this entire neighborhood." When Chris finished his accusations and sat down with obvious satisfaction, the chairman asked if we wanted to respond to her complaints about our alleged network sabotage. Chris stood up calmly, connected his laptop to the community center's projection system, and introduced himself with his full military credentials. The presentation methodically walked through months of evidence documenting Janet's systematic surveillance operation against multiple neighborhood families. Network logs showing daily unauthorized intrusions into our Wi-Fi over a 4-month period. Technical explanations of how each timestamp represented a separate incident of illegal network hacking under federal computer crime statutes. Visual demonstrations of how spy software had been used to monitor our family's private digital activities, including streaming services, website visits, and device usage patterns. Janet tried to interrupt several times during the technical presentation, obviously panicking as she realized how much evidence we had against her. When Chris revealed the spy software findings showing actual data samples of what Janet had been collecting about our family's streaming services website, visit sleep schedules, and activity patterns, The room went completely silent. People finally understood that this wasn't about network security or community protection. This was about a neighbor systematically spying on other families and documenting their most private digital habits without their knowledge or consent for months. The real bombshell came when Chris displayed a neighborhood map with multiple houses highlighted, showing that Janet's surveillance operation had affected at least 3 other families besides ours. Janet's face went white, then flushed red. She sputtered, "This is all lies. You're making it all up." Her hands were shaking now, her fingers gripping the table like she might flip it. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." Her voice cracked with the lie. But it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately demanded to know what information had been collected about her family and whether her children's online activities had been monitored. Mr. Thompson wanted details about his family's digital privacy violations and what Janet knew about their personal routines. The room erupted with questions and demands for information as neighbors realized they'd been personally victimized. Chris delivered the final twist with perfect timing and military precision. "There's something Janet doesn't know," he said calmly, while advancing to his final slide. "While she was monitoring our neighborhood families, I was tracking her activities as part of my cybersecurity investigation." He displayed logs showing Janet's own internet activity, the apps she used, her online schedule, and her device usage patterns. The ultimate irony was complete. The spy had been spied on by someone with far superior technical skills and training. Janet tried one last desperate denial, claiming everything was fabricated and that we were retaliating against her legitimate security concerns with fake evidence. The room was dead silent, everyone staring at Janet, then at me. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The HOA president spoke slowly. "This is a serious violation, Janet. This will go beyond this meeting." The meeting concluded with Chris's declaration that unauthorized network access and spy software installation are federal crimes with serious legal consequences under computer fraud and abuse statutes. This wasn't a neighborhood problem that could be resolved with apologies or HOA mediation. This was criminal behavior that would likely require law enforcement involvement and could result in federal charges against anyone who'd engaged in systematic surveillance of multiple families. After the meeting, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and dread. We'd exposed Janet for what she was, but I knew this wasn't over. Chris was already on his laptop processing the aftermath. "She's done for," he said, but even he didn't seem entirely sure. The immediate aftermath of Chris's presentation was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed at a neighborhood meeting. The room erupted with angry neighbors demanding answers about their own surveillance victimization. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up shouting, "You've been spying on my family for months. You know when my kids are home alone?" Mr. Thompson was furious about Janet having access to information about when his family left for work and vacation schedules. The energy in the room was electric with outrage and betrayal as people processed the violation of their most basic expectations of privacy. Other neighbors started connecting dots about Janet's impossibly specific knowledge of their personal routines. People realized that her comments about their habit schedules and activities hadn't been lucky guesses or casual observations. She'd been systematically monitoring multiple families and using that intelligence to position herself as the all-knowing neighborhood security expert while violating everyone's most basic privacy rights. The social consequences were immediate and devastating. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about Janet's privacy violations and her previous reputation as a strict but well-meaning HOA advocate completely evaporated. Families who had once defended her aggressive enforcement tactics now felt sick, knowing they'd been enabling a criminal who was documenting their children's activities and personal routines. As the police started getting involved, I realized this was more than just a neighborhood feud. They were talking about federal charges, privacy invasion, unauthorized access. Janet was in serious trouble. The whole neighborhood was watching, waiting for what would happen next. Janet made one final desperate attempt to defend herself, claiming everything was lies fabricated for revenge against her legitimate community safety efforts. But Chris responded with military precision, offering to have any independent cybersecurity expert verify every piece of evidence. He said federal investigators could authenticate the logs and confirm the criminal nature of Janet's surveillance activities. Her protest crumbled as neighbors realized no one could fake months of technical evidence. The weight of federal involvement hit everyone hard, as we understood this had moved far beyond neighborhood politics into serious criminal territory. The chairman called for an emergency vote on Janet's removal from all HOA positions and a permanent ban on future involvement in neighborhood governance. The vote was unanimous. Every single neighbor voted to strip Janet of any official authority and prevent her from ever again claiming to represent community interests. Her reign as neighborhood surveillance coordinator was officially over, and everyone knew it. Within days of the meeting, 3 affected families decided to pursue civil litigation against Janet, with Chris's technical evidence supporting their cases. The legal implications were serious. Federal computer crime laws, unauthorized access violations, spy software installation, and systematic surveillance could result in both criminal charges and substantial civil damages. The reality of what Janet faced began sinking in as lawyers explained that each instance of unauthorized access represented a separate federal offense with potential prison time. I couldn't help but feel a little guilty. Janet had crossed a line, but the whole thing felt bigger than I'd expected. Was this really justice, or had we just destroyed a life I couldn't answer? But I knew one thing for sure: things would never be the same in this neighborhood. The civil suits included charges of invasion of privacy, computer trespassing, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of federal surveillance statutes. Chris estimated that damages could range from $8,000 to $15,000 per affected family, not including legal fees and potential criminal penalties. Janet was facing the possibility of substantial financial consequences on top of federal criminal charges. The mounting legal pressure was visible every time I saw her, through the window looking haggard and defeated, as she met with lawyers and tried to comprehend the magnitude of consequences she faced. Janet couldn't walk to her mailbox without encountering hostile stares from neighbors who now knew she'd been spying on their families. Kids would point at her house when she appeared outside. Adults would cross the street to avoid interacting with someone who'd violated their trust so completely. Her neighborhood kingdom had become a social prison where everyone knew exactly what she'd done. 3 weeks after the meeting, Janet's expensive attorney reached out about settlement negotiations. Apparently, the evidence against her was so overwhelming that going to trial would be career suicide. The technical logs, device fingerprints, location data, and documented surveillance activities created an airtight case that no defense attorney wanted to argue in federal court. Her lawyer's desperation to avoid trial was evident in the increasingly generous settlement offers that arrived weekly, each one more substantial than the last. The settlement amounts were confidential, but they were substantial enough for the affected families to invest in comprehensive home security upgrades and cybersecurity improvements. Janet was essentially paying for the privacy violations she'd committed while avoiding the public spectacle of a federal criminal trial. Everyone got justice, but Janet avoided complete public destruction. At this point, I started wondering something. When someone gets exactly what they deserve, why does victory sometimes feel so complicated? I mean, Janet had systematically violated multiple families' privacy, committed federal crimes, and used her HOA position to legitimize illegal surveillance. She deserved every consequence she faced, but watching someone's entire life unravel, even someone who had earned it through their own criminal actions, created an uncomfortable mixture of satisfaction and unease that I struggled to reconcile with my sense of justice. Within a month of the settlement, a for sale sign appeared in Janet's front yard. The neighborhood had become impossible for her to live in. Every neighbor knew what she'd done, and there was no coming back from that level of trust violation. Moving was her only option for starting over somewhere else where people didn't know about her surveillance activities. I'll never forget moving day. Chris and I watched from our living room window as the moving truck loaded Janet's belongings. Other neighbors came outside to witness the end of an era. We weren't gloating exactly, but there was definitely a sense of watching justice being served. The moving crew worked efficiently, while Janet supervised from a distance, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize her. Her once immaculate appearance had deteriorated noticeably, and she looked like someone who'd aged years in just a few months. I watched Janet leave with her lawyer, her face red from embarrassment. The neighborhood had already started to turn on her. But as I looked around, I realized something: it was over for her. But what about us? What had we all lost in the process? Janet's car disappeared down our street for the last time. And honestly, the relief was overwhelming. The neighborhood returned to the peaceful, normal place it had been before Janet's arrival. No more clipboard patrols, violation notices, or surveillance concerns. Kids could play outside without worrying about being monitored. Families could enjoy their homes without someone documenting their private activities. Normal neighbor relationships resumed with friendly waves, weekend barbecues, and people helping each other with packages and lawn care. But something had changed permanently in our understanding of how vulnerable we all were to people who looked normal on the surface, but harbored dangerous obsessions with control and surveillance. The neighborhood changed overnight. What was once a quiet, peaceful place now felt charged with tension. Some neighbors avoided us, while others came forward eager to express their gratitude. Chris didn't let it show, but I could see the weight of what we'd done on his face. For me, it felt like a small victory. Justice, yes, but at what cost? Chris became something of a neighborhood hero, helping other families improve their network, security, and teaching people how to protect their digital privacy. The experience had shown everyone how vulnerable they were to tech-savvy criminals, and Chris's expertise became a valuable community resource. He installed secure networks for several neighbors and taught basic cybersecurity practices to anyone interested. The transformation was remarkable, as families who'd never thought about digital security suddenly understood the importance of protecting their private information from potential predators who might be living right next door. Looking back on the whole experience, Chris and I still discuss it occasionally. The lesson wasn't just about dealing with difficult neighbors. The lesson was about fighting back when someone victimizes you and assumes you're helpless to defend yourself. Janet's fundamental mistake was assuming her targets lacked the skills to discover and counter her surveillance activities. Janet picked the wrong family to mess with, and her assumption that we'd never figure out what she was doing led directly to her downfall. Chris's military cybersecurity training meant she was essentially conducting surveillance against someone who specialized in detecting and countering exactly that type of threat. The irony became a teaching moment for the entire neighborhood about the importance of understanding technology and protecting yourself from people who would exploit your ignorance for their own twisted purposes. The police were involved now, and things had taken a serious turn. Janet's lawyer reached out, but it was clear she was facing much more than just an HOA fine. Federal charges were on the table, unauthorized access privacy violations. The gravity of what she'd done was hitting her, and I couldn't help but wonder how far this would go. The irony was perfect, and the justice was satisfying in a way that still amazes me. The neighborhood is peaceful now. Everything a community should be that couldn't exist during Janet's surveillance reign. We have normal relationships with neighbors who respect boundaries and privacy. Everyone learned valuable lessons about cybersecurity and the importance of standing up to people who try to victimize others. The federal investigation expanded beyond our neighborhood as authorities discovered Janet had been researching similar surveillance techniques in online forums, suggesting her activities might have been part of a larger pattern of behavior. I'm grateful for the experience because it showed me what Chris was capable of and reminded me how important it is to fight back. Sometimes the best way to deal with people who try to control and intimidate others is to show them they picked the wrong target. Janet learned that lesson the hard way, and I doubt she'll ever try anything like this again. The consequence of systematic surveillance was systematic exposure, legal consequences, financial penalties, social ostracism, and forced relocation. Perfect karma. And as I finish telling this story, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we just stayed quiet and let Janet continue her spying operation. The thought of other families suffering under her surveillance while we remained silent would have haunted me forever, making our decision to fight back feel even more justified, despite the personal cost and emotional complexity of destroying someone's life. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease even as I watched Janet's life unravel. Sure, she'd crossed the line, but wasn't there a part of me that wondered if we were just as guilty for pushing her over the edge? I tried to bury that feeling, but it kept gnawing at me. Justice had been served, but at a price I hadn't fully anticipated. Some questions are better left unanswered, but I'm glad we'll never have to find out. The weight of what we'd accomplished settled over me like a heavy blanket. We'd exposed a criminal and protected our neighborhood, but the cost felt higher than I'd expected when we first discovered Janet's surveillance activities. The moral complexity of the situation became clearer over time, as I realized that sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting responsibility for consequences that feel disproportionate to the original crime. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once federal investigators became involved. Janet's defense attorney negotiated a plea agreement that avoided a public trial but resulted in substantial financial penalties and a permanent criminal record. The settlement payments to affected families were significant enough to fund comprehensive security upgrades throughout the neighborhood. Janet's surveillance equipment was confiscated as evidence, and her access to any digital monitoring tools was permanently restricted as part of her sentence. The federal charges sent a clear message that this type of privacy violation wouldn't be tolerated. The legal process revealed that Janet had been planning to expand her surveillance operation to include additional neighborhoods using our area as a test case for techniques she intended to implement elsewhere. The scope of her ambitions was chilling and confirmed that our intervention had prevented something much worse. The psychological impact on Janet was evident during the final legal proceedings. The confident, aggressive woman who'd terrorized our neighborhood had been replaced by someone who looked broken and defeated. Her carefully constructed image as a community protector had been shattered, revealing the disturbed individual underneath who'd justified criminal behavior as civic duty. The realization that her victims had been documenting her activities while she thought she was the invisible observer seemed to devastate her more than the legal consequences. Court-appointed psychological evaluations revealed underlying control issues and paranoid tendencies that had manifested in her surveillance obsession. The professional assessments suggested that Janet's behavior stemmed from deep-seated insecurities and a pathological need to feel superior to others through the possession of secret information about their private lives. The neighborhood's transformation was remarkable in the months following Janet's departure. Property values actually increased as word spread that the area was now free from the surveillance and harassment that had characterized Janet's tenure. New families moved in and were welcomed with the kind of genuine community spirit that had been impossible under Janet's regime of suspicion and monitoring. The HOA was restructured with new leadership that focused on actual community improvement rather than invasive oversight and control. Monthly meetings became productive discussions about neighborhood enhancement projects rather than platforms for accusation and punishment. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Janet had cultivated was replaced by cooperation and mutual respect among neighbors who now understood the value of privacy and personal boundaries. I watched as Janet's car disappeared down the street. For a moment, the world seemed to exhale, and yet I knew the peace we'd once enjoyed was gone for good. What had started as a small neighborhood dispute had turned into something much larger, and now the real question was, what would happen next? The whole experience changed us in ways we're still processing. We learned that privacy can be violated anywhere, even in the most peaceful neighborhoods, and sometimes the only way to protect your family is to fight back with everything you've got. That quiet suburban life I once took for granted now feels more precious, something that needs to be actively defended. The innocence of trusting our neighbors blindly is gone, replaced by a more cautious but healthier understanding of trust. Now, we know it has to be earned, not assumed. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced something like this in your neighborhood? Drop a comment below. And if you want to support the channel, hit the thanks button. Catch you in the next one.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe